welcome to this bonus episode of Cold War Conversations. Now, I'm a big fan of the History Daily podcast, where my good friend Lindsay Graham takes you back in time to explore a momentous moment that happened on this day in history. Visit historydaily.com or search History Daily in your podcast app to learn more. As an introduction to History Daily, I've selected 2 Cold War themed episodes that I know that you will enjoy. The first is the story of the nuclear-powered submarine USS Scorpion, which disappeared in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with 99 men on board on May the 22nd, 1968. The second is the story of the Velvet Revolution, when on November the 17th, 1989, police violently shut down a student demonstration in Prague, sparking a revolution that ended communist rule in Czechoslovakia. I'm delighted to welcome Lindsay Graham and the History Daily podcast to Cold War Conversations.
It's May 22nd, 1968, deep in the Atlantic Ocean, 400 miles southwest of the Azores. Francis Slattery, captain of the USS Scorpion, a nuclear-powered submarine, looks across the busy control center. Captain Slattery is 36 years old and a rising star in the United States Navy. He's trained for years to lead submarines like this into battle, but he's not taking the Scorpion to war today. He's taking his ship home. The Scorpion glides through the waters a few hundred feet below the surface, heading west toward America at a speed of 18 knots. The submarine hums with quiet and efficient activity that pleases Slattery. He's been captain of the submarine for less than a year, but knows every inch of his command. He can picture the ship's cooks busy in the galley, the engineers who are hard at work in the engine room, and he knows that 3 decks below the control center, a routine battery charge is underway. Captain Slattery decides it's time to come up to periscope depth. He gives the order, the submarine pitches upwards, and the words "Set Condition Baker" throughout the ship echo along the Scorpion's compartments. In response to Captain Slattery's order, the crewmen seal the Scorpion's watertight doors. This is standard procedure. Periscope depth is potentially hazardous for a submarine, as it's not always possible to detect obstacles near the surface. So Condition Baker is the order given to prepare the ship for any eventuality. But neither Captain Slattery nor anyone else on board is prepared for what happens next. The Scorpion shudders as an enormous explosion shakes the boat. In the confined space of the submarine's reinforced hull, the blast is concentrated into a deadly shockwave. Captain Slattery doesn't even get the chance to look around to react to the suddenly blaring alarms before a fireball engulfs the control center, and with a lurch, the USS Scorpion begins to sink. The crippled USS Scorpion tumbles slowly into the depths of the ocean. The pressure on the hull increases until finally the submarine implodes. Any of the 99 sailors on board who survived the initial explosion are killed instantly. The loss of the Scorpion will be a heartbreaking tragedy for the crewmen's families. But the sinking will also become an enduring mystery. How and why the Scorpion was lost will puzzle investigators and the public long after the submarine vanished in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on May 22, 1968. It's April 12, 1968, off the coast of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea, 6 weeks before the disappearance of the USS Scorpion. The nuclear-powered submarine lurks in the darkness, hundreds of feet underwater. On board, the Scorpion's captain, Francis Slattery, feels a bead of sweat trickle down his neck. He and the crew are bathed in the red glow of the submarine's combat lighting. There's almost complete silence. Sound travels far underwater, and no one wants the ship to be detected because the Scorpion is being hunted by another submarine. Thankfully for all, it's not an enemy out there, but an ally. These are NATO war games, and the Scorpion is playing the part of a Soviet sub. A few moments later, the other NATO submarine passed them by without noticing, and Captain Slattery's relief is mixed with a sense of disappointment. He's proud of his men, but he was expecting more from the captain of the other sub. If it ever comes to a real fight, he'll have to do better than this. During the Cold War, submarines have become the spies of the sea. The latest are powered by nuclear reactors, allowing them to run so quietly and stay underwater for so long that they're virtually undetectable. One of these newer submarines is the USS Scorpion. But even though she has a modern power source, the ship is in a state of disrepair. In recent years, most of the United States Atlantic submarine fleet has been retrofitted with new safety features, but not the Scorpion. The 8-year-old submarine is one of only 4 in the Navy that hasn't yet had an overhaul, and on this deployment, she's been plagued by mechanical issues. The crew has nicknamed her the USS Scrap Iron, and one sailor has complained to his parents in a letter that they have repaired, replaced, or jury-rigged every piece of equipment on board. So it's understandable that Captain Slattery and his men are looking forward to returning to America. When the war games are over, the Scorpion is ready to go home. But that's when Captain Slattery receives one last mission from the top brass at Navy intelligence. U.S. spy satellites have spotted Soviet ships testing suspicious weather balloons near the Canary Islands off the coast of West Africa. Since the Scorpion is going to be passing by anyway, Slattery and his crew are ordered to investigate. So in mid-May 1968, the USS Scorpion leaves the Mediterranean behind. Slattery sets course for the Canary Islands and the Russian surface ships with their weather balloons. The American subs slink silently under the targets, taking photographs and scientific readings. Then, with their mission complete, the Scorpion and her crew are finally allowed to head for home. It's May 27, 1968, at the U.S. Naval Base in Norfolk, Virginia, almost 2 weeks after the USS Scorpion left the Mediterranean. 22-year-old Barbara Foley huddles beneath an umbrella as rain pours down on the dockside. Despite the harsh weather, Barbara's wearing her favorite dress. She wants to look her best today because this afternoon her sailor husband Vernon is arriving home after a 3-month-long deployment on the USS Scorpion. Barbara has dropped off their 1-year-old daughter with a babysitter and braved the storm to wait at the dock alongside the families of other Scorpion sailors. Her husband's submarine is due back at Pier 22 at 1 p.m., but that hour passes with no sign of the Scorpion. Barbara and other wives, parents, and children linger anxiously at the base all afternoon, but Vernon and the rest of the Scorpion crew never arrive. The family presses Navy officials for answers, but they are assured that there's just been a routine delay. The Scorpion will arrive tomorrow, perhaps. Gradually, the families drift away, back to their empty-seeming homes. But as Barbara drives to pick up her daughter, she has a bad feeling in her gut. She's sure that Navy officials haven't told her the whole truth. And she's right. Soon it's confirmed that the Scorpion hasn't been heard from in more than 5 days. The submarine isn't delayed, it's missing. A huge search and rescue operation is launched by the United States, but no one has any idea what has happened to the Scorpion or even where the submarine could be. They'll have to scour the Atlantic Ocean from Virginia to Spain. As they do and days pass, hopes of finding the submarine intact on the surface somewhere fade. And finally, on June 5, 1968, the rescue operation is called off, and the Navy announces that the Scorpion is officially lost at sea. But the hunt for the missing submarine won't end there. The Navy will continue to scour the ocean for the lost Scorpion in hopes of tracking down the wreck and finding out what went wrong. It's early June 1968 at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., a few days after the search began for the USS Scorpion. Dr. John P. Craven hunches over a cluttered table filled with ocean charts, cups of coffee, and papers covered in calculations. John is a 45-year-old Navy scientist who specializes in deep water searches. But he doesn't use ships or sonar to find things. He uses math. 2 years ago, John was asked to find a missing hydrogen bomb that was on board a U.S. Air Force plane when it crashed in the Mediterranean. John helped locate that bomb using statistics and probability. So when the USS Scorpion went missing, it wasn't long before Navy chiefs turned to John again to crunch the numbers and help them find their lost submarine. What John needed, though, first was raw data. And for that, he turned to America's military and scientific listening posts. John thought that their underwater microphones might have picked up the sound of the Scorpion's demise. His hopes proved correct. On May 22nd, 3 hydrophones in different parts of the Atlantic each recorded a small blip of noise, followed by a series of much louder rumblings. John quickly concluded that the first blip was an explosion on board the Scorpion, and the later rumblings were the sound of the submarine imploding. Now, using all 3 datasets, John is roughly triangulating where those sounds came from. That should roughly give him the last position of the Scorpion. Through complicated math, he's able to narrow down the search area to a remote part of the ocean southwest of the Azores. The Navy dubs this area Point Oscar and sends out a survey ship to photograph the ocean floor, looking for the wreckage of the Scorpion. This ship, the Mizar, is led by another Navy scientist, Chester Buck Buchanan. Buck starts growing a beard on day one and tells his shipmates he won't shave until he finds the missing submarine. But as Buck searches the ocean floor, back on dry land, John Craven continues to analyze the acoustic data and thinks he's spotted something. According to his calculations, it seems like the Scorpion was actually headed east at the time of the disaster, back in the direction of Europe. John asks several experienced Navy captains why a submarine might make such a strange U-turn, and each captain gives him the same answer: torpedo trouble. The torpedoes on the Scorpion contained a failsafe designed to stop them targeting their own ship. A turn of 180 degrees would cause the warhead not to detonate. So if a torpedo were to accidentally activate while still on board a submarine, turning the entire ship around rapidly could, in theory, prevent a catastrophic explosion. John becomes convinced that a faulty torpedo was behind the loss of the Scorpion. But when he presents his theory to superiors in the Navy, they don't believe him. The acoustic data is open to interpretation, and weapons experts claim it's impossible for a torpedo to explode inside a sub the way John suggests. They think John is putting too much faith in math and doesn't have the seagoing experience they do. For his part, though, John suspects the Navy may be covering something up. After all, if a torpedo could explode on the Scorpion, then a torpedo could explode on any Navy submarine. And that not only means hundreds of American submariners may be in danger, it also means that the entire U.S. fleet may need emergency retrofitting, leaving the country open to attack. While John tussles with his superiors, in the Atlantic, the search for the Scorpion goes on for weeks and then months. Buck's beard grows longer and longer, but the Navy's patience grows shorter and shorter, and eventually they reach the point where it wants to call off the expensive search. Buck and John are forced to beg for more time, and the team is given one last chance. It's a chance that Buck takes. On October 29, 1968, John Craven gets a top-secret message from the search ship Mizar. In it, Buck Buchanan says he's finally shaved off his beard. John knows immediately what that means. They've found the Scorpion. The missing sub lies in pieces on the seabed some 2 miles down. John and his team have been proved right about the location of the Scorpion, but when the sub's wreckage is inspected more closely, new evidence will emerge that undermines John's theory about the faulty torpedo. And these fresh clues will bring investigators closer to uncovering how the Scorpion and its crew ended up on the bottom of the ocean. It's the summer of 1986, deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, 18 years after the sinking of the USS Scorpion. Oceanographer Bob Ballard pilots the state-of-the-art submersible Alvin through the inky darkness. No sunlight reaches these depths. The only illumination in this strange deep-sea world comes from Alvin's high-wattage headlights. Bob and his team have traveled to the bottom of the ocean on a mission for the American military to document the wreck of the USS Scorpion. As the submersible approaches the Scorpion, its propellers churn up a flurry of sediment from the seabed, showering the wreckage in an eerie snow. Bob maneuvers over the wreck and takes countless photographs of the shattered submarine below. Many will remain confidential military secrets for decades, but one crucial detail is made public. The Scorpion's torpedo room is found intact and undamaged. It's clear that a warhead did not explode on board and cause the accident, so it must have been something else. In the years that follow Bob Ballard's expedition, several new theories emerge about the demise of the Scorpion. Some point to a malfunctioning trash compactor, others to explosive hydrogen gas released by the submarine's batteries. But the most controversial explanation is that the American submarine was deliberately targeted and destroyed by the Soviet Union. To those who back the theory, the motive for such an attack was revenge. Just 2 months before the loss of the Scorpion, the Russian submarine K-129 also sank under mysterious circumstances in the Pacific Ocean. If the Russians believed the U.S. sank their submarine, they could have sunk an American ship in response. But many skeptics suggest that this is little more than a conspiracy theory and insist that there is no compelling evidence for such dramatic events. The truth about the last moments of the Scorpion may never be known for certain, But lessons have been learned from the tragedy, as the U.S. Navy has not lost another submarine since. But that has been little comfort to the families of the sailors of the USS Scorpion, the 99 men who lost their lives serving their country when their nuclear-powered submarine mysteriously sank on May 22, 1968.
And now from History Daily, the story of the Velvet Revolution.
It's November 17, 1989, in the streets of Prague, Czechoslovakia. Hundreds of thousands of students gather for a demonstration. They carry signs and chant together, marching through the country's capital as a single mass. The reason for this protest is as a memorial. Exactly 50 years ago, a similar demonstration took place to rally against the Nazi occupation of Prague. That protest turned bloody and brutal, and several demonstrators were killed. And when organizers asked for formal permission to stage this march, they framed it as a way of commemorating that horrible event. But that's not the only reason these students are gathering. For these protesters, Czechoslovakia is still not free from a controlling global superpower. For over 40 years, the Soviet Union has run the country with an iron fist, tamping down on personal freedoms, the freedom of the press, and any dissension to Soviet control. Resistance has been growing, though, through underground channels for decades. But today's protest marks a sea change. This march is the largest public demonstration against the government in 20 years, and it's only getting bigger. The march heads towards Wenceslas Square, where the anti-Nazi protest took place all those years ago. As they get closer to the city center, more and more people join in. Television crews descend on the area, broadcasting the demonstration to homes around the country and bringing even more protesters to the streets. With chants of freedom and 40 years or enough, the Czech people make their message loud and clear. They want an end to the Soviet regime and for the country of Czechoslovakia to be governed by its own people. They're determined to do it peacefully, but soon they're met with violence. As the group approaches Wenceslas Square, the Soviet-run police decide the demonstration must be stopped. Armed law enforcement rush into the crowd, beating protesters and rounding them up to be arrested. People who try to flee are met with blasts from water cannons and the snapping jaws of unmuzzled police dogs. In a matter of seconds, the peaceful protest descends into chaos. But this demonstration is just the first step in the journey to freedom. The violent end of tonight's march only proves their point. The Czech people can and must liberate their country. Since the end of World War II, the Czechoslovakian people have fought against the Soviet occupation of their country. Time and time again, their efforts were met with violence. But the more the communist government suppresses these acts of resistance, the stronger the opposition becomes. Whether the leadership knows it or not, the nation is nearing a breaking point, and the end of Czechoslovakia's communist rule will come in the form of a students' protest on November 17, 1989. It's January 5, 1968, in Prague, almost 2 years before a student protest will spark revolution in Czechoslovakia. The country's communist leader, Antonín Novotný, stands before Czechoslovakia's Central Committee, armed with a difficult task. Today he needs to identify and announce his successor. Since becoming president in 1957, Novotný has faced opposition from virtually all sides. In the post-war age, many people feel that Novotný hasn't done enough to bolster the country's economy. Over the years, he's refused to implement practically any reform, despite recommendations made by trusted economists. And with little change, the nation's industries have continued to flounder. There's also the matter of the Slovaks, who have been demanding more autonomy from the nation of Czechoslovakia for years. Novotný hasn't satisfied these calls for sovereignty either, which has lost him even more support. Nor does Novotný have much hope of building a base with the country's young adults. In 1968, college students across the country have only known Czechoslovakia as a Soviet-controlled communist nation. They've grown up facing the restriction of personal freedoms, censorship of the press, and many other roadblocks to free expression. Despite knowing much else, it's clear to them that something needs to change. And to young people, Novotny's leadership and the Soviet-controlled government in general have failed and continue to fail the people of Czechoslovakia. Without the prospect of a new generation's support, things don't look good for Novotny. Unable to regain any of the trust he's lost over his decade of presidency, Novotny has little choice but to step down. But unfortunately, finding a successor proves a difficult task. Novotny and the Central Committee can't seem to agree on the person who should take his place. Every time the president suggests a name, it's rejected, and the process begins again. Frustrated and exhausted, Novotny finally offers up the name of his Slovak opponent, Alexander Dubček. After hours locked in a stalemate, this familiar name seems as good a choice as any, and Dubček is voted in unanimously by the Central Committee. Technically, Dubček isn't the president. He's the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. And since he was elected as a last-minute choice, not much is expected of him. But Dubček doesn't see it that way. To him, this is an unexpected chance to enact some real change in his country. Unlike previous leadership, Dubček doesn't want to uphold the status quo. And by April, virtually all major government roles have been peacefully transferred from more hardline communists to reformists, including the prime minister, the president, and several vice premiers. That same month, the new government rolls out the crown jewel of their collective efforts, the Action Plan. This program aims to correct the many failings of the previous government. It includes major reforms to Czechoslovakian industry, changes to the country's constitution, explicitly supporting the civil rights of its citizens, and it grants more autonomy to Slovakia. Dubček's administration even starts considering a future where the Communist Party doesn't control the courts, a division of power that would be unprecedented. Dubček calls this new vision socialism with a face, and for the people of Czechoslovakia, it's exactly the progressive change they're looking for. By June, new political parties emerged that hadn't existed in the country since World War II. Some people even start talking about the idea of turning Czechoslovakia into a full democracy and shedding communism completely. But this catches the attention of the Soviets. Up until this point, the Soviet Union has been watching Czechoslovakia's political changes from afar, but eliminating communism in the country is a step too far. And all of a sudden, Dubček's so-called socialism with a face feels more like a threat to the Soviets, and it needs to be shut down. On August 20th, Soviet forces invade Czechoslovakia, abducting Dubček and several other reformist officials and taking them back to Moscow. Suddenly, the country that was enjoying a liberal reformation is under the control of the Soviet army. For the next 7 days, Czechoslovakians continue to declare their allegiance to Dubček and resist the occupation in creative, nonviolent ways, like removing street signs so Soviet soldiers get lost. But it's no use. On August 27th, Alexander Dubček finally returns to Czechoslovakia to tell his people that the progressives have lost. And from now on, the country will be run by the Soviet occupation under the control of hardline communists. After only 8 months, the period of liberalization that would become known as the Prague Spring will have ended, destroying the progress Dubček's government made. In some ways, the country will be back to where it was before. But for Czechoslovakians, this will mark the beginning of a long fight, and they won't be ready to give up just yet. It's January 16, 1969, in Prague, Czechoslovakia. 20-year-old university student Jan Palach weaves his way through the bustling crowds in Wenceslas Square. He's headed to the National Museum, a huge palatial building at the very end of the promenade. It's a busy Thursday, and Jan easily blends in with everyone else. Nobody seems to pay him any mind as he crosses the street and begins walking up the stone steps of the museum. At the top, Jan has a clear view of the square as it stretches out in front of him. He sees countless Czechoslovakians going about their day, socializing and strolling down the street. It's as normal a day as any, but Jan is about to change that. He quietly removes his coat, setting it aside on a railing. Then he pulls a bottle of gasoline out of his briefcase. Quickly, he douses himself, soaking his clothes from head to toe. Then he lights a match and sets himself on fire. Within seconds, those around Jan erupt in panic. People rush to him, flinging their jackets onto his body in an effort to put out the flames. They succeed, but not in time. Jan's entire body is scorched. An ambulance arrives and the young man is rushed off to hospital. Nobody knows why Jan would do this or whether he will survive his injuries. But within the day, Jan regains consciousness, much to the shock of doctors caring for him. He's sustained burns on over 80% of his body, and it's unlikely that he'll survive for more than a few days. But from his bed, he has enough energy to speak and explain why he did what he did. In a voice barely above a whisper, Jan says that he wants the Czechoslovakian people to wake up to the oppression they are facing. The memory of last year's failed Prague Spring is still fresh in the minds of young people in the country, including Jan. Experiencing the Soviet crackdown left him demoralized, and he feels that an apathetic pallor has settled over the people of Czechoslovakia. To Jan, setting himself on fire was a way of jolting the public into action. The police find a note that Jan had written before going to Wenceslas Square, which repeats the points he makes from his hospital bed. And for the next few days, Jan continues talking to anyone who visits him, declaring the need for the Czechoslovakian people to take action against the Soviet occupation and fight for their rights. But 3 days after setting himself ablaze, Jan dies from his injuries. Jan's death is treated as a horrible tragedy across the country. The site of his self-immolation becomes a memorial space piled high with flyers and candles lit for his memory. Other student activists protest the occupation in their own way, conducting a hunger strike for several days on the steps of the National Museum. And all throughout the country, the resistance movement continues to grow, though it has to be done secretly. In the years following Jan Palach's death, the communist leadership cracks down even harder, not just in Czechoslovakia, but in many communist-controlled countries. But the harder the Soviets push for control, the more the underground resistance swells. In January of 1989, demonstrators plan an event called Palach Week, in which people are encouraged to gather in Wenceslas Square to memorialize Jan and to protest the ongoing occupation. Nearly 5,000 people show up on the first day. It's the biggest anti-occupation gathering since the Prague Spring. The event is a peaceful one, but there's a charge to the air. For the first time in 50 years, Czechoslovakians are taking to the streets to protest the occupation, unafraid of the consequences. There's real energy behind this movement, and many start to think it's time for something big. Against the constant threat of violence from the Soviet regime, the anti-occupation movement has been staunch in its non-violent tactics. Soon those beliefs will be put to the test. In a few months, the fight for a free Czechoslovakia will reach its climax as regular citizens face off against the full force of the Soviet regime. But they will prove that the strength of the people can and will prevail. It's November 17, 1989, the day the Velvet Revolution will begin. 53-year-old resistance leader Václav Havel marches toward Wenceslas Square, chanting along with a growing crowd of protesters, many of them students. He and countless other radicals have been working toward this day for what feels like forever, and now it's finally here. The moment when Czechoslovakians band together to rid their country of Soviet occupation. But Václav, like everyone else at the demonstration, knows that the Soviet Union won't go quietly. It's just a matter of time before the police show up. And sure enough, as Václav approaches the square, armed law enforcement descend on the crowd. Police officers grab protesters and beat them senseless. Other demonstrators are dragged away and tossed into police cars. Václav isn't spared. At some point in the pandemonium, the police arrest him too. And for the Soviet occupiers, the capture of Václav Havel is a major victory. Václav is well known as the leader of the Civic Forum, a coalition of opposition movements in Czechoslovakia. He's practically the face of the resistance, and now the Soviets have him behind bars. While Václav sits in jail, a propagandist newspaper tries to paint his arrest as the death knell of the protest movement. Their angle is that the resistance will be powerless with its leader under arrest, but the people of Czechoslovakia quickly prove to the Soviets that their movement is much bigger than one man. In the days following Václav's arrest, demonstrators call for a countrywide workers' strike, along with daily demonstrations. Industry grinds to a halt, and the city streets are overrun with people demanding an end to the Soviet occupation. Demonstrators make it clear to leadership that they will not return to work until the Soviets step down. And this tactic eventually works. On November 28th, nearly 2 weeks after the first mass protest, the Soviet Union cedes power. The communists agree to a coalition government, with the newly freed Václav Havel serving as interim president. With this, the resistance movement has won, and the Czechoslovakian people have wrested back control of their country and managed to do it without violence. Václav Havel will be re-elected in 1990 in the country's first ever open election. He'll maintain his position until the so-called Velvet Divorce, when Czechoslovakia is separated into Slovakia and the Czech Republic. But even then, From 1993 until 2003, Václav Havel would continue serving as president of the newly formed Czech Republic. The Velvet Revolution, so named because of its nonviolent nature, will become a worldwide symbol of resistance to oppression. Its spirit will live on in ongoing forms of protest in the region, and for years to come, young people will still gather in Wenceslas Square to call for change in a myriad of forms. The fight for a better future will continue, but the current generation has the Velvet Revolution to thank for paving the way on November 17, 1989.
If you'd like to hear more from Lindsay, just go to historydaily.com or search for History Daily in your podcast app.